So the next session is going to be a little different. It's titled Brilliant but Brief. These are student presentations. Each presenter will have 10 minutes. Then we'll have 5 minutes for Q&A, open discussion. Since time is compressed, when you do ask your questions or make your comments, please keep them brief. We're gonna try to stay online. First presentation is Hiring the Ideal Remote Worker by Emma Williams-Barron. Emma, it's all yours.
Thank you. This is collaborative work with Claire Davis and Erin Macke. The three of us are graduate students in the Department of Sociology, just 5 minutes down the street here at Stanford. So to quickly set the stage, the 20th century saw rapid progress towards gender equality in many domains, but progress has slowed or stalled in recent decades. In the world of work, gender bias in hiring is particularly persistent, and mothers in particular face many penalties in their workplace outcomes. Scholars have noted we may need a serious shock to the system in order to restart meaningful progress to equity. Everyone in this audience probably recognizes that the pandemic has been an incredible shock in many regards, and our focus here is on remote work, which has been rapidly adopted and continues to remain quite prevalent. So this raises the question for us, how does remote work impact employers' gender bias towards workers? We know that in the hiring process, employers seek signals of workers' competence and commitment to work. And the idea of the ideal worker is someone who's strongly committed and devoted to work and available to work. But this conflicts with cultural perceptions of mothers who are held to strong descriptive and prescriptive stereotypes that they be devoted to caregiving. We argue in this project that ideal worker norms are deeply tethered to specific job features, and that changing those features, such as remote work, might impact gender bias in hiring. We know from prior literature about several job features that have been linked to employers' gendered preferences, and some work has found that motherhood penalties in hiring are smaller when jobs emphasize flexibility. We also know that remote work is assumed to be more flexible. So we developed two hypotheses for women. First, that they will be seen as less hireable than childless women when applying for in-person jobs. So this is replicating prior research, but similarly hireable for remote or hybrid jobs compared to childless women. And we expect these patterns to likely differ for men, since research has documented fatherhood premiums in in-person work, and also fathers face flexibility stigmas when they demonstrate commitments to caregiving. So we hypothesize that fathers will be seen as similarly hireable to childless men when applying for in-person jobs, but they'll be seen as less hireable in remote or hybrid jobs. To evaluate these hypotheses, we conducted an online survey experiment with 1,500 people with hiring experience and at least a bachelor's degree in the United States to approximate the universe of people making hiring decisions for remotable white-collar jobs. Each survey participant evaluated 2 job candidates for an open position. The position was described as either remote, hybrid, or in-person, and participants saw either 2 women or 2 men, one of whom had signals of parental status and one of whom did not. In the interest of time, I'm going to focus mainly on 2 main hiring outcomes, which are which candidate was chosen for hire by the participant, and which participant or which candidate the participant thought that the company would actually hire, regardless of who they would hire themselves. And finally, about our design, we use these interactive digital resumes to display the job candidate's information, which allowed us to collect digital trace data. Digital trace data are records of activity and behavior as people interact with a digital system. So this can include clicks, mouse movements, time spent on the stimulus, et cetera. And we're developing a methods paper on incorporating digital trace data into online survey experiments, which I'm happy to talk about more in the break. So here's our experimental stimuli for the job description, which signals job type in 2 places. And we developed the tasks and skill sections using ONET data. And then here's what our interactive digital resumes look like. We signal the gender of the job candidates in the gendered silhouette, the name, and by using gendered pronouns throughout the survey. And we signal parental status following prior literature in 2 ways. First, by describing a conversation with spouse and 2 kids versus spouse and pet, or volunteering on the PTA, instead, or volunteering in a neighborhood association. So now let's get to some results. I'll start by showing you the predicted probability of being chosen for hire by the participant across remote and hybrid and in-person conditions. So if we didn't find any bias in these hiring choices, if parental status didn't matter for being chosen for hire, we would see that the bars for both childless women and mothers would be equal at the halfway mark, 0.5, indicating a 50% chance of hire for each of them. But instead, we find a motherhood penalty emerging in the in-person condition, such that childless women were picked by participants for hire 58% of the time, meaning mothers were picked 42% of the time. And then very remarkably here, we find null results for motherhood penalty in the hybrid and remote jobs. But we might ask, is this really about moms or is this just parental status? So let's move the moms or the women up and bring in the men. Here, unlike for women, we find no parental status penalty or premium for men in the in-person, remote, or hybrid conditions. And now let's turn to our second main outcome measure, which is which candidate the participants thought that the company would hire, regardless of which they thought should be hired. This is an interesting measure because it's measuring their third order beliefs, which are linked to actual bias that we see in the world. And it also helps us overcome social desirability bias. So here we see, again, a substantial motherhood penalty for in-person work, with childless women being preferred over mothers 66% of the time. And now we also see gaps emerge for hybrid and remote work, though they are noticeably smaller, with childless women preferred 60% of the time in hybrid and 62% of the time in remote jobs. And then I'll move those folks up and we'll bring in the men. So interestingly here, we find, again, no fatherhood premium or penalty for in-person or hybrid conditions, but one actually emerges in the remote condition. So here, participants thought the company would hire a father 57% of the time. To help get at why these penalties might be emerging, we analyzed several measures of perceptions of the candidates. And the most notable one that I want to highlight for this presentation is perceptions of availability. So participants rated mothers or childless women as more available than mothers across all job types, in-person, hybrid, and remote, but that gap is largest for in-person positions. And then we also analyzed digital trace data collected through the resumes. Here I'll focus on time spent evaluating the resume. And I want to highlight that participants spent more time reading women's resumes in the remote condition and the least amount of time in the in-person condition. And then this pattern reverses for men. We argue that time spent on the resume can get at how important parental status was for making the choice. So if participants think parental status is a useful signal for making the choice between candidates, then it becomes an easier choice to make, and it's quicker to make the decision because they have more information that they can use to make that choice. Whereas if parental status is less relevant to the question of who we should hire, then participants have less information to go on making that decision between two otherwise very similar candidates. So they need to spend more time evaluating the materials. So to sum up my key findings, we document motherhood penalties in in-person jobs, but they shrink or disappear in remote and hybrid jobs depending on the measure. And I want to again highlight that null results here are particularly striking, given that prior literature finds very stubborn motherhood penalties across many different types of jobs. And basically whatever you throw at it, motherhood penalties are often very, very stubborn. And we find that moms are seen as less available for work across job types, with the biggest gap for in-person jobs compared to childless women. And they are rated as also needing more surveillance in in-person jobs, but not remote or hybrid. Whereas for men, we find reverses of these patterns. We find a fatherhood penalty emerging in remote jobs on one hiring measure, but no other differences in hiring outcomes. And we find that fathers are seen as less available in remote and hybrid jobs, but not in in-person jobs compared to childless men. And then finally, we find participants spend less time on women's resumes when they are applying to remote compared to in-person. I said that backwards. They spend less time in the in-person positions compared to remote positions, and the opposite is true for men. So to sum up our main contributions, theoretically, we argue that changing job features, in this case, the in-person, remote, or hybrid status of the job, can have really important impacts for who qualifies as an ideal worker. We think moms are less penalized in remote jobs in these data, because employers and decision makers might think that work and family can be more easily combined that way. And empirically, we contribute a focus on how remote work affects employers' gender bias towards job applicants, this sort of demand side focus, whereas most prior literature does the reverse, looking at supply side features about how remote options affect workers' preferences by gender and parental status. And then methodologically, we demonstrate how online survey experiments in sociology can incorporate digital trace data, which offer some really exciting new ways to understand experimental results. And we think there's enormous untapped potential there. I will end here and thank you very much.
Yeah. Any heterogeneous effects based on whether the evaluators gender, most evaluators employment status, whether they were in a remote job or a hybrid job or an in-person job?
Okay, great. And so for any online listeners who may have missed the first part, you're asking about heterogeneous effects by gender and employment status of the evaluator. And we did look at this, and we actually found that women were harsher on mothers than men were, which is kind of hard to piece out. So we're still thinking about that one. And then employment status of in-person remote, we also looked at that, and I don't remember anything exciting appearing. So I think we didn't see anything, otherwise I would remember that. But I can look back and talk to you in the break about if there's anything there.
Question, did you ask these hiring decision makers to describe in their own words the explanation of the hiring decision they made?
We actually did, yeah. So we have
Great.
open-ended text data. Okay. Oh,
You're going to tell us what you found?
And we're still analyzing coding. There's a lot of data to code through. So we have a research assistant who's been going through those data, and I have nothing to report at this time. Speaking just from having read through it myself, we find that people are very open with dissing moms sort of across conditions. They can come up with lots of reasons why moms are not as committed to work, or they're going to be distracted. But in the remote condition, they seem to be talking more about positive things of motherhood, that, oh, you're very flexible and you can juggle lots of responsibilities, which was pretty interesting to see. And we saw across the board lots of positive comments about dads. He's settled down, he's responsible, he must be really committed to work because he has to provide for his family, things like that. But no statistical significance I can report to you at this point.
This is related to Raj's question. Can you see if the evaluators are themselves parents?
We did collect those data. And again, I don't remember anything interesting popping up when we analyzed that. So I'm going to say for now that we didn't find differences, but I will look back at our robustness checks and report back to you.
And this probably you don't have in your data, but it'd be interesting to know if it's partly about feelings about persistence, like whether they think the mother will like take the job in person, but then quit quickly. I don't know if that's something you can tease out of the data that you have.
We do have a measure of commitment, which maybe gets a little bit at that, but not quite exactly what you're asking for. Yeah, so we don't have a perfect measure of that.
Were these supposed to be for 9-to-5 jobs, or sort of more totalizing jobs that might, absorb your whole life, like say research?
So the job description didn't describe the hours expected of work, but it's a marketing manager position, and you might expect that's kind of a normal 9-to-5. I think most people would think that. But obviously these types of roles often swell to absorb your whole life if you let them. So it's sort of up into the eyes of the evaluator on that one.
So I thought it was incredibly interesting. I was actually going to say one question is, when did you do it? I wondered about if you had funding just to repeat again, and also to try the country. I'm guessing it was the US, and it was maybe 21 or something, 2021.
It was 2022. So 2022. May and June 2022. And running again would be a great idea. So if anyone out there wants to share
maybe
some
someone
funding.
listening, but also it'd be interesting to see in another country, because the US is, I'd have thought of these gender norms. I think it's not top, but it's pretty high. If you could find another country that was way lower. I mean, it was a fantastic study. I was surprised you got such good, you have 1,500, which is, you can just, it's great.
Oh, thank you so much.
Okay, way to get us started off on the right track. Thank you very much. Okay, next we have Hira Farooqi, and I hope I don't mispronounce your name. You can tell me, who will talk about telework availability, women's labor market outcomes, and fertility choices.
Hi, everyone. I'm Hira. I'm going to be talking about my paper on, as Steve said, telework availability, women's labor market outcomes, and fertility choices. So even though in recent decades, there has been a substantial amount of progress made in terms of reducing the disparity between men and women's labor market outcomes, substantial disparities, as we all know, still exist. And in particular, current empirical literature agrees that the bulk of the remaining gap in men and women's labor market outcomes can now be explained in terms of the differential way in which parenthood affects men and women. This is even more concerning for the case of the United States, because the United States lags behind other developed economies in terms of policies that can support families with young children. And in addition to that, there are sizable socioeconomic costs associated with motherhood penalty as well, in terms of lost economic output, as well as its role in contributing to women's socioeconomic insecurity. And so one policy solution towards addressing this situation is the role of workplace flexibility. And that's what my paper is about. In particular, in this paper, I ask, to what extent can greater access to remote work jobs improve women's labor market outcomes around the time that they become mothers? To address this research question, I formulate and estimate a structural dynamic life cycle model of women's employment type and fertility choices. I use estimated parameters of my model to conduct counterfactual analysis that looks at the impact of different policies that affect the availability of remote work jobs. My model estimates suggest that mothers of children under 5 years of age, so in particular, women with preschool age children, rather prefer working in remote jobs compared to on-site jobs. However, because women's decisions, especially in terms of employment and fertility, are jointly related, the exact design of the policy instrument matters, and I'll discuss this more in a little bit. So I estimate, the sample that I use for this paper comes from National Longitudinal Survey of Youth 1997. For those who don't know, NLSY is a rich panel data set on a cohort of men and women born in the US in the 1980s. It includes very detailed information on their employment histories, their marital histories, and their relationship histories and their fertility histories. The sample that I use for this paper comprises of white women who are observed between the ages of 23 and 39 years of age during the years of 1997 and 2018. My final sample includes observations on about 2,200 women with 27,000 person-year observations. Unfortunately, NLSY 97 does not allow me to distinguish whether a job that a woman is working in can be performed from home or not. However, I do observe the standardized occupational codes of jobs reported in NLSY. I combine this information with information that is available in Occupational Requirements Survey, which is an employer-level survey conducted by Bureau of Labor Statistics, which, in addition to other employer characteristics, also asks whether an employer provides the ability to work from home to their employers. So I combine these two pieces of information together, and I'm actually able to assign each woman in NLSY 97 with whether she works in an on-site job or a remote work job. I'll quickly describe the descriptive statistics. Specifically, when we come to the labor market statistics, we see that in this sample, about 75% of women are employed. 57%, or the larger majority as we would expect, are employed in jobs that require them to be present on site, and about 19% of them are employed in jobs that require remote work. When we look at earning differentials between on-site and remote jobs, we see that remote jobs perform substantially better in terms of wages, both in terms of annual earnings and also when we look at hourly wages. So these are definitely better jobs. I'll briefly give a very high-level description of the model. So the model tracks women's decisions from the time that they leave school, which I assume to be around the age of 23, all the way till they retire at the age of 65. Each year during this period, a woman decides whether to work in an on-site job, a remote job, or remain unemployed. And if she's in the fertile period of her life cycle, she also decides whether to have a baby or not. Women's utility depends on consumption. So they enjoy consuming higher levels of consumption. Their preferences depend on having children and also working in the labor market. When women are making their decisions about which type of job to work in, they are aware that jobs in on-site and remote work differ in three main ways. So firstly, wages, as we saw in the descriptive statistics, are different in these two sectors. There are search frictions in the labor market. So women know that the probability with which they receive a job offer from each of these two sectors is also different and depends on their characteristics and their labor market statistics. Women also know that the utility cost of working in the labor market with children and without children is also different depending on which sector they choose. Women's choices are constrained by a simple budget constraint in the model. On the income side, this budget constraint includes their earnings if they work, depending on which sector they work in. And if they're married, it also includes their husband's earnings. On the cost side, I assume that if women work in the labor market, they have to incur a monetary cost of childcare. And so overall, every period, women act optimally by choosing the alternative that maximizes the expected present value of their remaining lifetime utility. I estimate the model in two steps. Firstly, I estimate some of the objects non-structurally by using NLSPA 97 data. This includes information on a woman's spouse's earnings, marital transition probabilities, and childcare costs are estimated using the survey of income and program participation. I also calibrate the discount factor to be about 0.95, which is standard in the literature on life cycle labor supply. And then I estimate the remaining parameters of the model, which include women's parameters related to wage equations, wage offers, as well as utility parameters using simulated method of moments. Now, just a snapshot of results. Overall, mothers dislike working in the labor market. And that's sort of in line with what we observe, that women's labor market participation takes a hit around the time that they have children. According to my model estimates, working in the labor market costs mothers about $3,500 to $4,000 in terms of utility. I also find that mothers of young children dislike working in on-site jobs significantly more compared to working in remote jobs. Mothers of young children in side jobs, according to my estimates, would be willing to pay about $6,000 annually for the flexibility of working in remote jobs. And that is about 17% of their annual earnings. I also find, based on parameters of the job offer probability, that college-educated women are much more likely to get job offers from remote work compared to women who don't have college degrees. And I also find that there's a high penalty of job switching, specifically in remote sector compared to on-site sector. Now I'm going to comment on some of the counterfactual policy that I evaluate. So the first policy that I evaluate is this situation where we basically allow the same flexibility in remote work to also mothers who work in on-site work. And I basically simulate the effect of this policy by equalizing the disutility parameters for mothers of young children working in on-site jobs and remote jobs. And this is kind of similar to Australian Fair Work Act, which was passed in 2009, which basically allowed parents of young children the right to ask for different types of work arrangements from their employers. According to my estimates, as a result of this policy, overall employment rates don't really change that much. We do see an increase in the number of mothers who work, but there is no change in the proportion of non-mothers who work. On the other side, fertility increases significantly. So both in terms of birth rates, which increase from 6% to 9%, and also in the decrease in the proportion of non-mothers. So basically what ends up happening is such a policy is basically only inducing more women who would have been employed anyway to now also start having children, because this policy is targeted to mothers in particular. In contrast, I next look at a policy which basically just increases the availability of remote jobs for everyone in the labor market. And this is inspired by the observation that, according to work by Dingle and Iman, 37% of jobs in the US can technically be performed from home. However, we only see about 20% of workers reporting any incidents of working from home. And this is for data from before COVID, by the way. So what would happen if you basically just increase the average probability with which women in my model would receive job offers from remote work sector? And as a result of this policy, I see that we have widespread gains for women overall in the labor market. Overall, the labor force participation increases by about 7%. At the same time, fertility rates remain stable. Increased employment, in this case, we see an increased employment in remote jobs compared to on-site jobs. And we see increases in employment both for women with children and without children. So just to wrap up, in this paper, I study the role of locational flexibility on motherhood penalty. I find that locational flexibility is greatly valued by mothers of young children, and my policy simulation suggests that an increased supply of remote work jobs can lead to widespread gains in women's employment, conditional on the exact structure of the policy that we're using. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Great. I don't see any hands up, so I will start. Two quick things. As just a check on your model, you should re-estimate it for men. Okay, obviously the fertility is you can decide how you want to deal with fertility, whether it's fertility of their spouse or just ignore the fertility entirely, but you sort of expect to get smaller effects for men. Second, it'd be nice to take your model and tell us how much welfare has increased for women as a result of the increase in remote work, according to your model.
Both are great points. And actually, I've never heard anyone else suggest that I should do this for men, which I think is super interesting. I'm definitely going to look at that. I am in the process of doing those calculations that would allow me to get an idea of like how lifetime utility changes as a result.
Hi, thank you. I have a question about the interpretation of the willingness to pay estimate that you have, whether we should interpret it purely as a willingness to pay for the flexibility, or whether it also reflects something that we've seen in the first presentation, the kind of hiring discrimination that women face for in-person jobs. So I might take a lower paying remote job if the probability of getting a job is higher.
I think, thank you. That's a great question. I think in my case, because this is a partial equilibrium model and it's only looking at the individual's decision problem, I wouldn't go as far to say anything about whether the individual is also thinking about how the employer is reacting to these choices.
Oh, I think such a fascinating paper, and the one that preceded it. This is a sort of non-academic lay question about what the trend is here, because the paradox is very clear, isn't it? That there are penalties and premiums that women are experiencing as a result of post-pandemic trend, but the structure of work remains, if you like, masculine or based on an old premise that men would go into a fixed place of work for a fixed period of time. So I guess I want to ask you, are you optimistic that the actual structures of work might change as a result of the kind of data you're producing?
Thank you. That's such a lovely question. I love layman interpretations of like all this econ talk that we do here. I am optimistic because I think if we think about this as a series of steps, the first step is ensuring that the attachment to labor market remains like that is the first thing that's preserved around the time that they have children. And then maybe the next step could be thinking more carefully about the exact structures and what that means. So from my perspective, I think I'm optimistic because at least this particular dimension of flexibility means that they get to stay associated with the labor market even around the time that they have children.
Post-pandemic,
right?
There's a different impetus, isn't there?
Right.
Do you feel that?
I'm not sure I understand this because one obviously like this research agenda is inspired heavily with the work that Professor Golden has done, but the exact measure of flexibility that she looks at is a little different than remote work, and I can only speak to the one that I'm focusing on here.
Okay. Hira, thank you very much. Super interesting. So telework availability can affect the number of children.
Yes.
That's for sure, but also it can also affect the quality of children, right? In the sense that if you have access to time use survey, whether you could basically look into whether those who can telework spend more time with their kids and then help with their homework and so on. That could I think will be a very nice addition to your paper.
That sounds amazing. And that's probably the next paper I'll write. I've been looking for like follow-up questions to this. I would love to talk more about this later on.
All right,
Thank
thanks
you.
so much.
Thank you.
Okay, next up to the plate, Hoyoung Yoo, and I hope I didn't, oh, good, I did reasonably well that time. The welfare consequences of incoming remote workers on local residents.
Okay, so thank you for including this paper in this exciting conference. My name is Hoyoung Yoo, a job market candidate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Today, I am very delighted to present my work, The Welfare Consequences of Incoming Remote Workers on Local Residents. So as people in this room all know and are very excited, the number of remote workers markedly increased in recent years in the United States. These remote workers have the geographic mobility and can move around and can potentially affect local residents if they move to new destinations. When we think about the relationship between the local residents and remote workers, there is an interesting economic aspect arises, which is that high-skilled, high-income remote workers will consume goods in the local economy. For example, going to restaurants, bars, coffee shops, but they will not compete with local residents for local jobs because they have jobs in hand when they move in. So this is an interesting question to understand how these kind of remote workers having these aspects will affect the local residents. And simultaneously, a number of cities in the United States have implemented so-called remote worker relocation programs that subsidize remote workers moving in. So in this paper, I asked what are the welfare effects of incoming remote workers on local residents. Even though the policymakers have some intention to implement these programs to benefit local residents, but we don't know much about how these incoming remote workers will affect local residents. Furthermore, I asked the counterfactual question, what if these remote workers are subsidized by local residents through tax? So this is what this paper about. So let me give you the overview. So this paper begins with collecting a census of details of all the remote worker relocation programs in the United States, adding to some Raj's work. And then the empirical setting of this paper is Tulsa Remote, which is the first and the largest program in the United States. So given these two interesting institutional facts, I wanted to better understand the program. So visited Tulsa in person, and I acquired the program data. And I learned that the first cohort of remote workers actually all kind of concentrated in downtown area. So by using this spatial distribution of remote workers, and I conduct the event study analysis by having the local employment by industry sector as the outcome variable. Especially, I classify industry sector into two sectors, one, local service sector, and two, all the other remaining tradable sector. The motivation of this classification comes from whether the remote workers affect local residents directly or not, which again comes from non-tradability of goods. Then I find the labor reallocation between these two industry sectors. Then I turn to a structural model to quantify the welfare analysis, incorporating the equilibrium effects and run a counterfactual experiment. So it would be great, we can kind of do all the counterfactual experiments in the real world, but we cannot do that for many reasons. So the setting up the model allows me to run some counterfactual experiments that I am curious about to answer in the model. So this map shows all the remote worker relocation programs in the United States. And as long as remote workers can verify the full-time employment, they will get into the program and get some incentive packages, mostly cash grants. And funding usually comes from local government and sometimes even non-profit organization. In Tulsa remote case, the funding coming from actually the non-profit organization, Billionaires Donation. So again, I use the remote workers downtown concentration as the empirical strategy variation. And I find, this is the event study analysis result. I indeed find in downtown area, the population increases and they show high income. But on the local resident side, the number of local service jobs increase, However, the number of warehouse jobs declines. Then I turn to a structural model, and there are all mathematical equations behind, but not to bore you, but I wanted to deliver the model intuition by using the graphs. So let's think about 5 markets without the program before remote workers coming in. So as I mentioned earlier, local service goods market, the equilibrium is determined within the local economy. They are all consumed where they are produced. However, on the bottom graph, the tradable goods market, this economy is small enough to take the price of tradable goods as given, and this is set by the outside of the economy. So that's why we see the horizontal line of the price. Then for service labor market, there are tradable labor market. The equilibrium objects are determined within the city, and also the land market. So now let's go through how these remote workers change the local economy equilibrium. First of all, they will consume some local goods, go to restaurants, and they need to eat something. So the demand curve shifts to the right. Then now, acknowledging the potential positive profits, more local service firms want to enter, and they need more labor to produce goods. So labor demand curve also shifts to the right. Then this increased employment in the local service sector comes from the tradable sector. The reason is because previously tradable sector working workers are aware of more relatively lucrative jobs in local service sector. So they switch their industry sector and go to the local service sector. Interestingly, the remaining tradable sector workers, though, also experience the wage gain because now the labor force in the tradable sector becomes scarce. Also, the price of land goes up too. But tradable goods, demand also goes up, but the price doesn't change. So now let me show you the estimation results. So I used indirect inference. The key parameter of the model was the elasticity of labor supply substitution of workers, which is identified by the demand shock driven by this influx of remote workers. And I crucially used the event study estimate, the local service sector employment increase to discipline this elasticity. So from the estimation results, summing up, the local residents commonly experience the price increase of local service goods and land, but there is the variety gain. For example, there were only like Italian food, American food, but now remote workers are sharing the fixed cost of local service firms to enter. So now there can be Japanese food, Thai food, which can benefit local residents too. On the other side, but the local residents heterogeneously experience the effects of remote workers because of the different wages by industry sector, and they have different consumption share and the land ownership. So all in all, there is the increase in nominal income on average, but this was stronger for low-skilled workers due to their higher preferences attached to local service sector. However, on the welfare side, this was stronger for high-skilled workers because high-skilled workers have greater benefit from the variety gain, who are more closely aligned with remote workers' taste preference. So the last exercise I conducted, as I hinted earlier, was about the counterfactual experiment. What if remote workers are subsidized by local residents? Because the Tulsa remote case was the billionaire's donation, exogenous funding. So this can be meaningful, informative experiment to other cities which are considering adopting this program. So one more government budget balance constraint kicks in. So now the tax is collected from the taxpayers, and that is distributed to remote workers. And the key feature is that the number of remote workers here is the function of the subsidy amount. And I showed this is still beneficial up to the certain threshold, but the benefit size becomes smaller. Economic efficiency gain here is the consumption externality that can be shared with more population. So let me conclude. So this paper sheds light on a new place-based policy, remote worker relocation programs, and the program can benefit local residents on average mainly through the higher wages and the variety gain. Generally, policy evaluations of remote worker relocation programs should consider equilibrium effects, such as labor relocation, distributional effect, skill heterogeneity between high-skilled workers, low-skilled workers, local economic condition, the elasticity of housing supply, and the industry's composition, as well as some public finance perspective if they are subsidizing remote workers by tax. Lastly, I want to comment that this paper does not address the welfare in the other cities where remote workers live, but I would say this opens a lot of new, more exciting research questions to be answered. Thank you so much.
Andre Parhomenko. Very nice paper. I know you didn't have a lot of time to talk about the model, but I'm curious what happens in the housing markets, right? Because these incoming migrants, they may increase rents, but they also increase house prices. So renters would lose, homeowners would benefit. And you probably have enough data about the house, unless you are doing it already, you probably have enough data to do some kind of back of the envelope calculation.
So I do included housing market in the model. Sorry, I didn't show the event study analysis about the housing prices, but indeed, actually, I didn't find that much statistically significant effect on housing price increase. And that reason was because the housing supply elasticity in Tulsa is very high, 3.35, which was relatively from Sizes paper, 2010. So because of that, I disciplined the how much price increase by using this housing supply elasticity, borrowing from the literature. But indeed, the model calculate the welfare analysis effects from the landowner side and the renter side as well. Yeah, sorry that I didn't show it too much, but I can talk more later too.
Jesse Matheson, University of Sheffield.
Oh.
So first of all, very cool paper. I just wanted to ask, can you say anything about what would be an optimal number of migrants into a city that we would see? Because eventually I would think that the strain on land rents is going to become such that you just get nothing but negative welfare effects by adding more remote workers. And also, I mean, thinking about what happens to the welfare in the cities that leave, I think that's a really interesting direction to go with this.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Hard to answer within one sentence because there is a lot of depending kind of factors that we need to consider. But in Tulsa case, what I can show was the at this hump shape graph, at the peak, this was the optimal number of remote workers, but there was indeed some group who are hurt by the program. But this is only say about the aggregated impact of the program.
Hi, super quick question, beautiful paper. I was curious if you had any predictive models of what might happen if and when remote workers might leave these places. I know that we saw a shift from tradable jobs, manufacturing jobs to service jobs, and there's the concern that remote workers might not always be there to be on the receiving end. So what happens to the economies when they leave?
Yeah, that's also a great point. So from the empirical finding, the Tulsa remote program administrators say like 87% of remote workers stay even after the 1 year of the committed period. So it can be kind of empirical question in the long run, what will happen? What if the retention rate becomes so low? But yeah, that's a good point.
Hi, David Agrawal. Thanks. It's a really interesting paper. So in the model, you have a counterfactual where you're thinking about the remote workers being subsidized, but it's also possible that the reverse could be true, that remote workers could actually be subsidizing residents, which would be the case if taxes were, say, based in the state of employment and location of employment. So it might be interesting to think through, are there any other outcomes that different outcomes that would arise in that case? And then that maybe raises the issue of that the job is mobile, but the person might not be.
I see. Yeah, sorry, this was my bad because I included the taxpayer remote workers as well. So incoming remote workers and local residents now pay together to subsidize remote workers. And another aspect of remote workers is that even though they are being paid by $1, but what they can bring is $1 plus their income. So this can be a little bit different from just focusing on local residents too. We can talk more, later.
Yep. I really like this, by the way. Nice, very, very nice work.
Thank you.
The question I had of some of these different jurisdiction relocation programs that you've talked about, some of them have different success rates or stickiness rates in terms of how long people actually, how many come and how many stay, and seems to be tied to local acceptance, and that seems to be tied to, this is kind of a question here, how the local community funds and then helps integrate in and help assimilate in outsiders who are coming in, versus some communities where they're like, oh, you're just here in an Airbnb and then we don't want to talk to you, you're creating traffic, and there's an us versus them split. Do you see any of that matching up with what you're doing here?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So in Tulsa remote case, they try a lot of effort to kind of make these remote workers be more engaged with like local community by like holding monthly dinner event and distributed like this $10,000 cash grants over one course of the year, not just as the like one-time pay thing. Yeah, they are paying a lot of effort to that, but it's still open question whether like how the outcome will be. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Last presentation of the day. Who is the Digital Nomad? By Alma Frydman.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Very impressed by your stamina today. It's been a long day, but a lot of really amazing work has been presented. My name is Alma Frydman, and I'm studying economics and sociology here at Stanford. So today I wanted to share some data from my SIEPR paper on digital nomadism. I'm going to give a really high-level overview, and I'm very happy to talk more after the session. So to start, you might be wondering, Okay, so to start, you might be wondering what a digital nomad actually is. So the US Chamber of Commerce states that digital nomads are remote workers, including self-employed individuals, freelancers, and employees, and they travel domestically or overseas, and the internet keeps them connected to jobs, coworkers, and clients. The term was first coined by Macke and Manners in 1997, and while they vary in age, profession, and duration in different travel destinations, I define them as location-independent workers who rely on ICTs to work remotely while they travel. They make residential decisions based on interests and passions rather than proximity to a fixed workplace, and with no fixed itinerary or plans to return home. They are a very compelling case study into how people make choices about their lives independent from the demands of a geographically constrained job. So as my own undergraduate journey was interrupted by the pandemic, I wanted to understand how remote arrangements would change my own future, and wanted to look at digital nomadism, as there has been very little research into this lifestyle within academia, despite the pandemic massively accelerating this work arrangement. So I obtained funding to travel to 7 different sites in Mexico and interview 50 subjects about their professional choices, their work patterns, their identities, and the advantages and sacrifices of this work arrangement. I was most fascinated by how instability and flux of a travel lifestyle impacted their identity, their productivity, and the role of work in their lives. So to start off, there has been a drastic increase in the number of individuals that identified as digital nomads, as well as the availability of jobs to sustain this lifestyle, and the number of countries offering visas and paths to citizenship to remote workers. So 66 countries now have visa programs, up from 54 when I first submitted my paper last year for review. So this is growing quite quickly. Of course, the migration of high-earning individuals working from their laptops to poorer countries has sparked debate around currency arbitrage and gentrification. And while the number of nomads themselves isn't that overwhelming, their purchasing power is quickly changing the world, and academic literature on the subject is quite limited. So from my interviews, I did ethnographic research. Subjects tended to be young, male, and highly educated. They worked jobs in software engineering, in marketing, in design, data, and earned an average annual income of about $93,000 a year, compared to the average salary of $20,000 a year in Mexico. The majority were from the US and Canada, Argentina, Mexico, and Colombia, which made sense with time zone restrictions.
So throughout the study itself, I was surveying individuals who were rotating between digital nomad hotspots, which were places with the infrastructure to sustain remote work, such as co-working offices and their corresponding social circles. And I was particularly curious as to how constant change impacted their professional identities and the quality of their work, as well as their adherence to different workplace norms and their self-concept as professionals. Now, of course, all of this data is self-reported, but it was still striking to see how many subjects reported increases to their self-assessed productivity and motivation to work. 70% of subjects reported some increase to their productivity, and 88% reported they were more motivated to work. They attributed this mostly to lower levels of stress, a desire to prove themselves to a potentially skeptical employer, and a motivation to efficiently complete their work so that they could go and take advantage of leisure time in whatever travel destination they were in. Furthermore, the self-accountable nature of their work necessitated them to be extremely disciplined and focused in completing their work. Many cited the advantages of shared co-work spaces as commitment devices to stay on task, and they were generally used for silent and individual work rather than the collaborative nature of a traditional office setting. And in each new co-work that they worked from, digital nomads established some sort of impermanent office dynamics that lacked the strict workplace roles associated with traditional offices, which I found particularly interesting as many companies such as Meta or Chevron are actively selling office real estate. And so the traditional office is undergoing this transformation. Its need and its function is being reevaluated. My second central finding was around the choices, or rather the sacrifices, that nomads made in order to sustain their location independence. A critical yet unsurprising conclusion was how subjects were overwhelmingly logistically and relationally detached. So as you can see, the vast majority were single, childless, and over half had sold their belongings to go and pursue this lifestyle. It was fascinating to see how many had even ended relationships in order to travel full time. It heavily signaled their personal commitment to this lifestyle and the concrete decisions that they had made in order to work in this arrangement. But they didn't just make personal decisions to sustain this lifestyle. They also made really striking professional ones. When I asked them how much of a raise they would need in order to return to a hybrid arrangement that would geographically restrict them, 70% of subjects said that they would just not consider it, no matter the raise. And for this majority, location independence was worth more than any raise, which presents a different view to how economists have traditionally modeled what motivates a worker's professional pursuits. So the ability to work and travel is central to their identities, and thus workers sacrifice promotions and pay raises and were even willing to search for new jobs to maintain their nomadic lifestyle. So their identity was extremely centered on location independence, and while their work was important, it was not the central thing that defined them. They overwhelmingly define their identities according to location independence, adventure, and learning, and were strikingly detached from traditional identity definers, such as political affiliation or nationality or religion. What defined them was constantly in flux, and their personal identities developed often alongside their social and their professional networks. So this brings me to my last central point, which is the subject of my most recent paper, which is that digital nomads are personally, socially, and professionally defined by constant flux. So this is the figure of my core finding. Essentially, when digital nomads travel, they change their social networks as well as their worker and professional identities. When their personal identities change as they pursue new interests in new places, their social circles change again, which cause them to gain new professional skills or grow entrepreneurial ambitions and their professional networks. So you can move clockwise here, starting from worker identity, and see how the prioritization of their remote status allows for personal development in new places. And then in these new places, they develop their sort of socio-personal self-identification, which brings them to a new situation, physical situation, changing their social circles again, which inspire new professional and networks and ambitions. So I argue that this transformation occurs at a much faster pace than you would find in a traditional work arrangement or even a work from home arrangement, and it impacts the quality and the pace of their work. Now, My conclusions support, my overall findings support the conclusion that they maintain their lifestyle above many other personal and professional considerations, and they make active decisions to support this objective. They detach themselves from belongings, from relationships, and inherited ideologies to travel freely. Digital nomads value their location independence not as an extended vacation, but rather as a key element of their identity. So there is obviously much more work to be done, and I've been so energized hearing all of your empirical studies presented today. There, as of right now, has been no empirical study conducted on digital nomads, which is something I'm hoping to change. And I am very open to any feedback, any possible research questions and directions coming from this initial ethnographic study. So thank you all so much for your patience and your time. And yeah, I'm very grateful to Stanford for the support and the funding that I've received, and to my advisor, Nick Bloom, for all of the help throughout the last year. Thank you guys so much.
Hi, Jesse Matheson. That was really interesting. Do these nomads, do they see themselves as this being something they're going to do for a fixed period of time, or is this a lifelong decision that they see themselves as making?
It's a really good question. I think the lifetime value of someone like that, like a digital nomad, is still very undefined, because before the pandemic, this was not a very popular lifestyle. From the majority of the interviews I've conducted, people were like planning to do this basically until they found a place to settle and have kids. That was like the main end to this lifestyle. But there were many nomads that I spoke to that were well into their 40s and 50s that saw themselves doing this throughout their life until they no longer physically could.
Callum Williams, just two very quick kind of points of clarification, I guess.
Sure.
And forgive me if I've misunderstood. So the first one is on the self-reported productivity, what's the counterfactual? And the second is the 70% figure on the wage increase. Does that account for cost of living differences? Because I guess people tend to go to places that are cheaper to live. So once you control for that, what's the sort of true figure?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that that is something that I'm still working out on with the data. I think on both of those points, because this was all points that the data that I coded out from ethnographic interviews. So I was not able to necessarily control for all of the factors. Specifically on the second point, that was a central motivator as to why people wouldn't return home, because most people were either American or Canadian, where the cost of living is extravagantly high. And people were saying that, you know, in living in Mexico and earning, you know, 75% of what they would have earned in San Francisco, they had a quality of life that was beyond anything that they could have afforded before.
It's really, really interesting. I like the ethnographic vein. And because this is such a new phenomenon, at least at scale, you can't get a whole life cycle history. But there are other groups that share some similarities with this, and three come to mind, and it'd be interesting to take the same ethnographic approach to them. One is military officers in the US military, in the Army. Basically, you have to be prepared to move your entire family for 2 years. And there's people who've been doing that for decades. So if you go and interview colonels, major generals, and so on, you can get a life cycle perspective on this. Second are people who want to be upwardly mobile in the managerial ranks of large international hotels. Same thing. You're moving sometimes across continents, but often across large distances with a family in many cases, frequently. The third are the diplomatic services, at least in many countries. So it's not exactly the same group, but it shares some of the similarities of you're tied to a place, but only for a particular period of time. Then you got to move on. You have less control over where you move on. So anyway, I think it'd be interesting to complement what you've done by looking at those groups as well.
I really like that. I think I'll definitely consider that in my literature review for my next paper. But I think a central differentiator between all of those groups is that digital nomads don't have to be tied anywhere. Like that's the whole point, right? So they don't want to have anything restricting them. Often that includes any kind of financial or relational commitment, which was very evident in my ethnographic findings. But thank you for that.
I guess this probably doesn't go totally with the digital nomad idea, but I'd be curious whether firms are also arbitraging this cost of living difference. Like anecdotally, one of my friends now is a software engineer. He used to work in the Bay Area and now works in Mexico at the same firm. So I don't know if it'd be possible to get data on that, but it'd be interesting to see if this is changing firms' locational decisions.
Yeah, absolutely.
So thanks for your presentation. This is Raj. Of course, this is a topic I deeply, deeply care about. So one quick thought is there's also a class of workers who are experiencing digital nomadism for short periods of time. So they will go for the summer, and some companies are using that as a way to structure flexibility. And the reason I bring this up is, and maybe those workers have different motivations and incentives compared to the permanent nomads. But given what you said in the beginning, the 65 countries which have now introduced these visas, now no country tracks whether you're in the country for the entire year or for 2 months. And if this takes off, this would be a huge shock to immigration policies.
Absolutely.
Because what prevents me now to go to Canada for 2 months on a digital nomad visa, work there, and then move to a different, so something to think about in terms of the duration of their stay as well.
Absolutely. I'm really interested also in how, work, travel, like combined, even short-term digital nomadism is going to completely transform the tourism industry. You can already see infrastructural changes in how hotels are organizing their business centers, and the different amenities popping up, for example, in Mexico City, where a local bodega has been turned into a co-working office specifically for this group of people. And one other note on the digital nomad visas, I was speaking at a conference in Bulgaria of all digital nomads, where one of my collaborators asked how many of you who are all digital nomads have a digital nomad visa, and only one person out of like 300 raised their hand. So clearly these visa programs aren't actually being utilized because they don't want to be tied to anything at all. That includes a tax code, that includes some sort of immigration status. So what's really challenging about conducting an empirical study on this, and I'm very open to suggestions, is how do you even track how many digital nomads are in a country if the country itself doesn't keep track of it? A firm doesn't want to admit that their workers are overseas, and it's very difficult to survey thousands of remote workers that to self-admit that they're working potentially illegally in another country.
David Agwell. So one thing that's usually linked to a place of residence is government services. And obviously, if they're not in a place for a certain number of days, then they might not be able to get access to those potentially health insurance, healthcare, unemployment insurance, education, right? And so maybe the visas are covering this, but even in the US at the state and local level, this would be an issue. So are they just giving up on this? Are they somehow falsely declaring a place that's their primary domicile to get access to those? Or like, what are they doing to get those services if and when they might need them?
That's a fantastic question, and actually something that I have been working on for an internship this summer also. So really would be so happy to talk with you more afterwards. The short answer is that they are getting private global health insurance and travel insurance in terms of planning for permanent disability or retirement. This is just not something that's in their foresight at all. They tend to be very in the moment. And so that's just not something that they're really planning for in terms of how nations are dealing with it. There are specific residency requirements in Europe where you have to be in a country for 163 days in order to access those social safety net benefits. And most people, some people are actually even skirting the requirements so that they don't have to pay high enough taxes in one country. But then they are kind of falling through the cracks of these social systems. So happy to talk more about that afterwards.
Okay.
Thank you guys so much.
Clearly, your next SIEPR grant should be to pay for you to go to the top 10 resort destinations in the world. So you can search out all those digital nomads who aren't actually registering in the visa systems. Thank you. That was great. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot to everybody.